So as we're getting set up, just want to, Alex was kind enough to introduce all of us. We're all really involved in kind of the supplier, data center operator, cloud service provider relationships, working a lot with trying to collect sustainability data, namely carbon data, and really looking to talk with you today about not only some of those challenges that are involved in that kind of data collection and normalization and inventory, but also some of the opportunities and the imperative that we see for taking that kind of data collection and measurement and turning it into action. So want to talk through that today. We have, first we're going to talk about kind of the data center value chain missions, the criticality of embodied carbon in particular, which I think we've talked a lot about in different sessions today. Supplier engagement, which we're all involved in, as I just said. And then a little bit of our practical real-world stories of how we're all working together and working with our other suppliers, customers in this kind of setting. So measurement isn't enough. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. It's really important that we get this measurement component right. And we have other sessions that, we have, Kellie and I have one that we're involved in later today to talk through that a bit. But we can start working on the decarbonization component as we're working on perfecting that measurement component. And we really think that embodied carbon is an important piece of that. So just to kind of level set too, want to talk through a little bit about where the emissions in data centers lie. I think most of you are probably very familiar with this. Scope 1, all those emissions you burn on site, that's going to be your generators most likely, is kind of your biggest contributor to that. Scope 2, an incredible amount of impact. That's all the purchase power that you're using. And then this huge other bucket of Scope 3 emissions. And when we think about the embodied carbon in the data center, it's really those first two categories. So purchase goods and services and capital goods, how you're building the data center and what you're stacking it with. And those are where we're going to focus our efforts on today. So I'm with Schneider Electric. I'm really lucky to work with a team that produces a lot of thought leadership on, in this case, where emissions lie in a data center. Came out with this study about a year ago, just taking an example of a 1 megawatt data center running off grid emissions. We can see that, over the course of the lifetime of that data center, Scope 2, the majority of the impact. But what we are seeing too is that Scope 1 or Scope 3 emissions have a really big impact at different points in the data center, and they're not insignificant. Just because that Scope 2 number shows pretty high doesn't mean that the Scope 3 number isn't valid. And when we think about the success that a lot of data center operators are having, Meta in particular, other hyperscalers, in securing renewable energy for how they're powering their data centers, that Scope 2 piece of that pie is going down, and it makes Scope 3 a much bigger imperative for us to deal with. And we can go to the next one. And I like to harp on this a little bit, the theory of the time value of carbon. So what we kind of saw on that last slide is that right at the outset building the data center, you're having a ton of Scope 3 emissions. And then over time, the Scope 2, your energy use, is going to make that go up. But every time you need to replace big amounts of equipment in the data center, you're going to have another spike in that Scope 3, right? So one of the things about the fact that we're kind of front-loading those Scope 3 emissions is that they're spent right now. When you buy a piece of equipment, when you build a data center, those Scope 3 emissions, they're spent. And if they're really high today, we don't have the opportunity in the future to reduce the potential impact of those emissions. Whereas with Scope 2, we can build a data center today and, slowly but surely, clean up the energy source on that data center. We have opportunity to reduce those Scope 2 emissions over time. We don't have that with embodied carbon. And the unfortunate thing about emissions, they're cumulative. So, if we're front-loading a whole bunch of emissions today, they're building up, they're, accumulating, and so it makes it incredibly important that that's where we put a lot of our focus. So go ahead into the next slide. So I'm going to hand it over to Kellie. She's going to talk a little bit about how Meta is working with suppliers on this very issue.
Hey everyone. So how many of you are involved with emissions data? Okay. And the rest of you, relationship is like complicated. It's coming. It's coming for all of us, whether you want it or not. Most of you then know that data is messy. It's noisy. How you collect it, how you're reporting it, whether through EEIO or from LCAs from your partners, how you're reporting it out, maybe through CDP or environmental report. Not a lot of standardization, and there's a lot of challenges that we're facing in this data collection. So I'm going to hand it to Leslye, who's going to talk a little bit more on some specific examples.
So yes, as we've heard already, what supplier engagement is so important because what's a scope 1, 2, or 3 for a supplier becomes my scope 3 and becomes potentially the scope 3 of one of my customers. So we're really all connected in this, and we all want the same result, right? We want to get to the reduction portion, not only measuring carbon emissions, but really how do we make it right and how do we reduce that carbon footprint. So we engaged with some of our suppliers. Last year, actually, we started that a year ago, and we asked the same question to two different vendors. Can you please provide us with your report of cradle-to-gate emissions of last year? And what we found is that one single question comes with multiple different answers. And the reason why we have different answers is because it's not easy, as Kellie mentioned. It really comes with a lot of complexity. Data is out there, but it's not easy to gather. It's not easy to process. So everyone is doing their best. And in our case, what we saw is this variety of data makes it hard to normalize and compare. And of course, the first step would be tracking where the data is going, and that's going to be the next slide. But for now, at least, realizing that the diversity of data shows up a challenge in the suppliers. We have different readiness levels, and this is part of what we want to propose in OCP, is to create a framework to make it better, make it easier for suppliers to actually quantify and report their emissions data. So now, so you have an example. This is a very loaded slide, and you don't need to read every data point. But what I want to show is like a case study. We started these questions last year. This year we came back again asking for now 2023 report data to the same ODMs. And what we're seeing is a difference in the numbers, a progress in the numbers. Ideally, we would want to see that those numbers are getting smaller, right? Because we're going to the reduction portion of the initiatives for carbon emissions. So what we saw that in one case, for example, you can see there ODM-A, it has two green arrows because their numbers went down. But it's important for us that are working on this type of problem to understand what's behind that data. Read beyond the number itself and understand what's the methodology that they actually used to provide that data. In the case of ODM-A, in our case, yes, their scope 2 and scope 3 reduced significantly. Scope 2 is, because of what Andrea mentioned, they implemented renewable energy, so of course their scope 2 reduced significantly, great job. Scope 3 reduced as well, but because they changed the methodology, they learned that we were also implementing renewable energy, so the way they calculated it is now different. So great, kudos to the transparency, kudos to the good work and collaboration. Now, let's also see, for example, the other ODM, they both provided the same type of system, so we would expect that the carbon footprint could be similar, at least at some point. And what we saw in the other ODM is the numbers actually went higher. So going back to the engagement with the supplier, why did this number grow instead of reducing? Because that's where we want to go. And honestly, they did a good job. What they did in here is that last year they weren't accounting for some portion of their scope 3, and this year they are now accounting it. So it's not that they're doing worse, it's that they're being more transparent. So what we want to propose is this framework that helps them gather the data, feel comfortable sharing it, and all of us actually working towards the reduction portion. So I'm handing off to Kellie again.
Okay, so we're telling you that embodied carbon is really important, and we're telling you that data is really important, but it's also pretty messy. And so where do we go from here? As Leslye just mentioned, the collaborations are really important. We have to do these things in parallel. We have to work towards these reductions while improving upon our data collection. And if you come at 3:30, you'll hear us talk a little bit more about how we're working towards that. So we're doing these things in parallel, right? If you're not working with us, you may be working with us in the future, and a couple members of my team are here. You'd be working with all of us in a collaboration and a partnership where we're working towards measuring that progress. So what is our commitment? How are we measuring progress towards that commitment via the data? And then we're helping that inform our decarbonization efforts. Now, we've told you the data is a bit messy, so this is an iterative process. And where we start with this is how we're approaching it, is that we're engaging you directly as a partner of Meta's. So we introduce this program to you. We want to meet you where you are. You may have a public commitment. It may be as aggressive as ours. It may not be. You may not have anything in place. And so we really want to introduce this program to you. We want to align on our commitments. And then we start to develop this roadmap. Okay, we've made this commitment. How are we going to get there? What does that even look like? And so we collaborate quite frequently and in sessions like this where we understand the challenges that you're facing and how we can build a plan of action to achieve that common commitment. With that data that we're constantly working in parallel to improve the granularity and the accuracy of, we're measuring that progress. So how are we confirming that the actions we're taking are not only having impact, but we should continue, going down that path or maybe applying it more broadly. And then finally, this is an ongoing collaboration. So as Andrea mentioned, what we buy today, those are the emissions that we assume. Our commitment is 2030. This doesn't end in 2030. It continues 2031, 32. It's going to be a continuous process. As long as we're buying material, we're going to be generating emissions. And the reality is this is a field that's growing. And so those emissions are going to continue forever, possibly. Okay, I'll hand it back to Andrea.
Thanks. So, we as a big supplier, we're engaging with a lot of our data center customers on this very topic, Meta in particular. And so what our customers are asking us to do is say, what is that roadmap? And Kellie talked about that a bit. And for us, that comes down to how do we roadmap the carbon reductions that we're trying to achieve, particularly in this case, within the equipment that we're selling to our customers. Now, I'm not going to go in depth to this slide, but we're also a company that's very interested in sustainability. I hope that that comes through. And so we have a lot of decarbonization goals and initiatives that we try to achieve no matter who our customer is. This right here, this is kind of our big picture. This is what Schneider's doing regardless of who our customers are. And it's my job, Alex's job, our team's job, to try to figure out how that applies to specific customers, how that applies to Meta, how that applies to any of our customers who we're selling equipment to. And there are many different levers that we can pull to achieve decarbonization on top of our own renewable energy goals, on top of our own supplier engagement. When we work with our customers, we know that there are a number of different eco-design levers that we can apply to achieve decarbonization. It really runs across the gamut, across the life cycle of the product. And just like Kellie and Leslie's job is to meet their suppliers where they're at and have a handheld approach, ours is the same. All of these levers are not going to be the same for every one of our different customers. We're working really in tandem with them. Things specifically when we think about packaging or logistics, that's going to be different depending on customer, and the effects are going to be different. And so we need to be able to engage and start to put kind of numbers and timelines to this kind of lever roadmap. So what does this all come back to? 3 main buckets. 1, engage your customers, engage your suppliers. This is a high-touch activity. One size doesn't fit all. If the data wasn't so messy, if the problem wasn't so complicated, we could have a one-size-fits-all thing, but it's not. And that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to strengthen those relationships. Meet your suppliers where they're at. Meet your customers where they're at. You know, we're all on this journey together. I think in the iMasons session earlier talking about sustainability is a team sport. We have to do this together. Increase visibility. EPDs are a fantastic start. Attend our session at 3:30. We're going to talk about our carbon disclosure form. You know, we need to increase the visibility in the supply chain and for product sustainability. And then incentivizing decarbonization. Make good choices. Implement systems that are going to carry on beyond you know, the next year or two. If I win the lottery tomorrow, I want to make sure we have the systems in place to continue on the work that's going on within our team. Sorry.
Well, now, finally to the call to action, right? First, it's establishing best practices within the value chain for embodied carbon, since it has some such big importance. Come back to the session later to talk about the second portion of the of inviting data center operators to require the carbon disclosure, to do their carbon disclosure through the disclosure form that they're going to talk about later. And the third one is really where we want to invite OCP to work together to create a framework, potentially a work stream within the sustainability group, where we create a framework to rank the suppliers, to help them understand where they are and go to where they want to go. So how do we make it easy for them? Let's create that framework and that guidance together as an industry. Then also, of course, sharing best practices to compile the disparate embodied carbon information from various vendors. The way we do it is probably different than the way that Meta do this, and it's something that we learn through this exercise of collaboration. Is the best way to learn, is sharing best practices. And finally, just share also the decarbonization success stories, because that creates also motivation and continues the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you.